Hello, Paul. Hello, anyone else who is following our conversation. This session will be dedicated to the divide between ancients and moderns, responding to your latest Odyssey video, link posted in the description of this one. I will follow some notes and we'll take it from there along the way, might add something to it. I'm following the order of your discussion, of your exposition. And somewhere at the beginning of your video, you suggest, nay, you claim that I strongly disagree that we are still human beings with respect to the ancients. Well, I really don't know what you're talking about there. That's, if you take it face value, that proposition is just, that claim is just patently false and absurd. But let's look at the dynamics of it. Perhaps what I will say here will help us agree that it has no reason to be. It's unjustifiable. Now, on the other hand, you do seem to believe that there is only one single conception or experience of time, and you seem to believe that when I highlight a departure from a classical pre-modern understanding of time into the modern symbolic, universal, abstract conception of time, I am ipso, by that very thing, by that very fact, suggesting that all languages and all conceptions are relative, historically relative. So I would be an historicist. Now, that is an extreme position. I regard this as an extreme position. Indeed, I regard the two alternatives that, as you present them, as two extremes that feed into each other. On the one hand, we have a static experience. We all experience time the same way. We all have the same conception. That's fine. On the other hand, we have the notion that there is no such thing as time per se, that there's no essence of that which we speak about, but there is only experiences and conceptions that vary along the ages. I was about to say throughout time. But then what is time? Now, both of these notions, I think, are wrong. It would be make for a pretty picture to say that from the beginning of time we all had the same experience of time. Nevertheless, there are obvious aspects of our lives that suggest otherwise, that at least open up the possibility of, in fact, open us to the recognition that there are distinct conceptions of time that are not in any straightforward way compatible with each other. One need only consider the child's sense of time to recognize that it is certainly not the progressive, expectation-oriented or clock mechanical one that ordinary adults today in our liberal world society are habituated to, have been habituated to, have been raised to cherish. And of course, you have studies in anthropology, for whatever that counts, that argue that tribal societies have their own notions of time that have little or nothing to do with our own. Um, what I have, on the other hand, argued, and I thought I had done that with adequate clarity, is that entering into the modern world entails a reification of notions which deserves to be called a progressive reification. So, the ordinary setup of our lives, the ordinary context of our lives, is reified into what we could call a kind of laboratory world where all notions and the general concepts, shall we say, the general terms of our experience, linguistic terms, that shape our experience, are abstracted and undergo what we could call, again, a progressive modification. A progressive because it unpacks, unfolds throughout the stages of the coming of age of the modern blueprint, but also progressive formally, constitutionally, in the respect that these notions are oriented towards the future. Thus, time is seen as a flow, yes, as a flow, evolutionary flow of things moving towards the future. Hence the anxiety so characteristic of modern man. Now, what I am arguing is that we do not have a future-oriented society in the classical world. One could object, for example, that although the Greeks do not place any emphasis on the future, what about the Hebrews? The Hebrew Bible, prophetic, impulse, pointing to the future that promises of God promises the future. But as Leo Strauss has aptly pointed out, this is the obvious, but today what is obvious is usually not perceived as such. For the Hebrews, the future can be never anything more or better. Indeed, it will likely be falling short of the origins. And the origins are envisioned as somehow beyond the past. But in order to access those origins, you turn towards the past and you retrace yourself to those origins through the obviously mythical, poetic figures of the biblical accounts. So one name leads to another, X, son of Y, Y, son of Z, and so forth, and you retrace. And of course, this gives you maybe 4,000 years, whatever you can count. But, and this guy lived 900 years, and the other guy lived 200 years. Now, if you take at face value, you say, well, look, we have to go back to a better environment, better air, and fresher food. That's patently nonsensical. Obviously, these numbers are, we would call them today manners of speech, but they're imbued with a sense that is more profound than that. They're not just casual numbers, I would argue. But in any case, these are, let us say, images that allow the ancients, on the face of things, even in a very, even superficially literal way, to say, well, that there is a path. Imagine all of these ancestors being stepping stones to highlight our bond to the origins. So what does that, and the origins are good, they're supremely good. So life is all about recovering the origins. Moving into the future, we're not. We're going back. And the fact that there's a promise of a wonderful future simply suggests that, okay, there's an image that is before us, okay, that reminds us of the origins. Okay, so there's definitely a going back, and there's nothing better than what we can be led back. Now, going back for the Hebrews, of course, would be impious. It would be impious for them to say we can do it on our own. It's the return is a divine gift, obviously. Yeah, it would be hubris. It would be preposterous for us to assume that we can make it all the way back without divine intervention. So we have to say, at the end of time, so to speak, at the end of the ages, yeah? So there's this image of the future. God will bring us back. Restore. Restoration. Restoration. So there is nothing progressive about the pre-modern world. But that suggests that there is a sense that we're not temporally moving forward. If anything, we're temporally moving backward. And in my articles, I have tried to unpack the dynamics of this sense, this experience, this conception. Okay? And this is rooted in what Aristotle calls the nun, the now, which he understands and presents as the pivot of the dynamics of the physical world. So we have the horizon of the past, the horizon of the future, and the pivot allowing the two to interact is the present. But this dynamic relation is obscured to the extent that the present is shut or is obscured itself to its vertical dimension. Okay? By vertical, we could mean the openness, the constitutional, permanent openness of the present. Indeed, the present as this opening to what we could call the eternal. So, what is ultimately the case? It is through this dynamic interaction between the two poles, the two horizons before which, on a horizontal plane, as it were, the present finds itself, that the present remains, well, we could say, present. Now, where does that leave us? Is there a possibility of alienation? Can men be alienated from the present? Yes. And to that extent, they can lose their own being and, end up in in a bubble of delusion of loss of being. And so all of this madness that we see today, loss of meaning or sense of meaning, of life is meaningless, is the, shall we say, the manifestation of this alienation from our what in Aristotelian terms we could call our natural place. Everything has a natural place. If I don't stand here, let's say I am a mechanic and I'm not in the mechanics workshop, I'm out of place. It's not, I'm a fish out of water and I'm alienated. Well, the same can be said of a painter. If the painter's not in his own workshop painting, he's alienated qua painter from his natural place, the place where he is naturally without being compelled to leave it. But what about a natural place for a human being? Where's that? And if we're alienated from that which I'm calling the present and its permanent openness to eternity, then we are alienated from ourselves. And so we're confused. We end up in another place and we are estranged and we're broken and we are disintegrated. We're not integrated. But we're integrated into something new instead of being integral ourselves on the path that is proper to our being. So that is what I was talking about. So if we have a novel conception of time, that does not mean that we're no longer human beings. It means that we're alienated and that we have lost sight of, shall we say, a natural conception of time, which does not answer the problem, but does provide a context for understanding the problem, appreciating the problem, rising vertically. Okay, but if we do not have that stage, that, shall we say, the first cave in Platonic terms, if we have or alienated from that first cave and end up in a little corner of it to reconstitute the cave in new terms, abstract terms, we can be very confused. We're likely to be very confused, and there will be no openness recognized. We will be alienated even further from our natural place. So we'll speak about time, but we'll mean something that is incompatible with the original constitution of the term. Indeed, the natural sense of time. And then, as it is the habit of moderns to do, we will project our own abstract notions onto all epochs and certainly onto the beginning of time of man, and we'll say, look, ever since the beginning of the human being, whatever that means, the beginning, human beings have been technological, have striven to develop their technology to escape from violent death because they're moved by fear, and of course they're progressive and moving towards a universal society. Okay, although they were not aware of that. But we are, because we are brighter, because we're enlightened. So this is the whole historicist mode of projecting on everyone else what we are up to. And this is also bound, by the way, to in political terms, to the notion that we should be exporting our freedom, our enlightenment to others. We project it onto them. We say, you want to be like us. Everybody wants to be like us, so we will help you. And sometimes we'll help you in a pretty violent way until you accept to be like us. And very often doesn't work, so that engenders more and more political strife, which is, can be called war. So you get to, Paul, the question of Nimrod's tower. For indeed, your argument is that fundamentally we've always been up to the same thing from the beginning of time, and so the Bible corroborates when it speaks about the Tower of Babel. They took that seriously. And you say, well, look at Nimrod. He had his tower. And you object to my consideration that the ancients would have considered that impossible. Just as Plato and his fellow citizens would have considered Socrates' perfect communistic regime as impossible. And you know that some, Leo Strauss, among the recent people, have argued, and I think thoroughly successfully, that Plato shows us that he is well aware, and Socrates is well aware, the whole argument tells us in the Republic, that This vision that Socrates is a painting of a perfect society, communistic society, is a chimera. It cannot be realized, as we say, you know. And there's just too many obstacles. Nobody's going to want to do it. It's absurd. And besides, technically speaking, it's just not manageable. Such a revolution, drastic revolution, would need to be put into place, and with all of the horrors that it would entail, that it's, nobody will want to do that. Nobody in his right mind. There's no point. However, you say, well, then why warn? Why even talk about it? Well, because as you know, Plato's political regime is just an exteriorization. It's a macrocosmos of the, or I should say, a mirror, right, of the life of the soul. So the ordering of the city is just even a shadow, right, a mirror of the ordering of the soul. It's to be understood in terms of the ordering of the soul. And so by this, he would be suggesting that although this communistic regime is impossible, I am letting you know that it's impossible to show you that there is such a thing as madness, that there is a mad attempt to, well, there's a mad deviation within the soul, right, that can take place. It's self-deception, delusion. There is such a thing as delusion. And delusion is not, entailing reality in the respect that I could be deluded to be Napoleon, whereas I am not. And I could be deluded to reach the sky, and, the Latin poets would speak about it. It is the only, it's the fool who says I can grab the sky. Ovid, others, they're fully aware of this, and they tell you it's only the fool would do this. And they don't mean that, oh, be careful, there's people who are doing it. They mean, look out, look at the fool. He believes that he is doing it. He's confused, the poor fool. Let's not go further. Okay? He's trying to reach the stars, the sky, and from there you have the classical distinction between the fool and the madman. You see, this is picked up and developed very well by Dante. In Dante you have the fool, and you also have the folle volo, the foolish flight of Ulysses, who's trying to reach wisdom, divine wisdom. And he fails. But he's just a fool. On the other hand, you have the madness, la matia sometimes called. And this madness is much worse than the foolishness that is attributed to ancient fools. And that madness for Dante is incarnated in those who believe to be the consummate recipients of wisdom. Perhaps they have not reached it on their own, they have reached it through divine intervention, but now the fact of the matter is that they consider themselves to be the recipients, the possessors of that which fools seek out. And the moment you believe to be in possession of that truth, of that wisdom, of that divine goal, then you are utterly mad. And that's dangerous for Dante. Okay? But the ancients did not worry about that because, there had been no establishment of a universal church, for example, that would open up the doors to that, what we could call a mass delusion. We're all, recipients of divine wisdom. Truth is with us, and whoever has not received it is not up to date. And so, it's expendable, really, to the extent that he does not corroborate our own wisdom or the very fact that we're here and that we're wise. So, for instance, the Jew will, by his own existence, will stand there to corroborate our story. See, it's because through the Jew that there has been the rise of universal wisdom. We are the recipients of God's wisdom. So now, for Dante, these folks who believe to be the recipients of wisdom and who can look down upon, shall we say, the unwashed masses of pagans or whatnot, they are dangerous. They are madmen. Okay? They believe also that that it is foolish to be otherwise than what they are, and so they will despise sometimes the pagans. Although there are those, of course, there are good Christians in the Middle Ages who will recognize that wait a second, that's not the way it goes. We can admire ancient virtue because it is only through ancient virtue that this reception of divine wisdom is possible, and still the reception does not dispense us with philosophy, because we could be fooling ourselves as recipients. What is more, we did not receive the revelation. It was previous generations that did, and we are receiving it through them. And although there is the Logos that is alive, the living Word that speaks within us all, to cultivate an ear for it requires somewhat of an effort. It just, as long as you want to be sure that you're not fooling yourself, that you're not in a state of delusion. For indeed, you could be piously, innocently, receiving these words, and they could comfort you. But ultimately, if you recognize their significance, then you'll see that what these words of wisdom are inviting you to is their meaning, and that meaning is only disclosed through an effort that we could call study. So the hardships of study properly understood. Okay, so that is, I will go back to my notes. That is the point of Nimrod's Tower. Why do you reckon, I'm reading here off the notes, why do you reckon Plato paints a picture that nobody would have thought possible to realize? And you're suggesting that, the Bible would not have wasted our time, anybody's time, warning about something that the authors or the author assumed to be impossible to realize. To warn about an imminent threat, or is that why they're writing the story of the tower, for instance? Or to expose a silly deviation of the mind. There is such a thing as madness. So escape madness, okay, by recognizing it for what it is. And to show you that there is such a thing as madness and that it is madness, I will paint you a picture of a political regime that is mirrored along the lines of that madness, and or the folly. And so, to be precise, the Tower of Babel is a foolish enterprise that is not crowned by this triumph that is really madness, but it is crowned by a collapse. Foolishness collapse on itself. I can spit as hard as I want to the sky, but it's going to fall back out to me. So it's not going to get there. It's not going to stick onto the sky. Now imagine if I thought that for some reason I came to the conclusion that it stuck. So I was able to spit up to the sky. I reached the sky. Well, that's madness. But that doesn't happen in the Tower of Babel. It doesn't happen. The story shows you that foolishness does not lead to that crowning, which, as you could consider to be wonderful if you're mad, or once you have it, or recognize it as for what it is. Now, so what about Socrates, Plato? Well, Socrates is helping young philosophers awaken to their pre-Socratic delusion. This is the suggestion that I propose to you. You have these foolish students who want to become wise and gain the wisdom of the gods. And he said, well, wait a second. Imagine if you had a society that is structured, shaped as your soul at this point. In other words, you can see the orientation of your soul mirrored and magnified in this picture. Now you start seeing that this is just silly. Forget about it. There's no point. It's stupid. It's foolish. Let me get back to the notes. Now, the Bible suggesting the inevitability of the tower's collapse. And, however, this has nothing to do with historical fatalism that you tongue-in-cheek attribute to me. Because you're saying, well, Marco, so what? Now, if the tower is going to collapse, that means that modernity is going to come to an end and we don't have to do anything about it. That's essentially historical fatalism. And that's absurd. The inevitability of the collapse is predicated on the pursuit of the enterprise, I note here. So, it is an exercise in futility. This does not mean that we should accept it. I mean, if I say that there is a foolish enterprise that goes nowhere, and it's going to collapse anyway, it's not going to lead to the demise of the human being as such, or of the human soul. So I don't have to worry about it that much. This doesn't mean that I should accept it as my fate. No. The fact that I'm not going to be able to change the state of affairs today because, we're in the second cave, we're not going back to the first overall, that ain't going to happen, does not mean that I must bow to the dictates of the second cave. Of any cave. The fact that I'm stuck in the second doesn't mean that I cannot in some way recover the horizon of the first and leave the cave as a proposition, the cave in general altogether. Find a way out of the labyrinth of words and so forth. Well, however that plays out is a big question, certainly, but I'm speaking in somewhat of a vague generality. So, now you bring up the idea of human form. Okay, I think this was maybe related to Greek sculpture, but we'll get to that. That is precisely what we have in the Jesus of the Gospels. Ah, yes, I am suggesting. The second true Adam, in whom we can discern the virtue of all heroes. Okay. Now, when I say this, you seem to understand these words in ugly terms. So, you associate this, which is a classical lesson, to Jordan Peterson, without noting that for Peterson, the poetic universal is groundless, or grounded in the meaninglessness of evolution. Now, for the classics, on the other hand, the poetic universal, so Jesus as an icon, Jesus in whom all heroes, or the heroic character of all heroes is manifest, is a mirror of what is hidden to and within men. You could say the Christ. So Jesus is a mirror of the Christ. You say, well, it's just a simple, abstracted, cut-out picture from a magazine, and it's not connected. No, that's the whole point of the Eucharist, by the way. The food that I give you contains my self, my soul. The meaning is not meaning, the meaning, in other words, the end for the sake of which you're eating this food is within the food, because it is in the mind of the giver. The Father prepares the food for you, and there's a reason why he gives you the food. That reason is within the food. That food will not be there without that reason. So when the child eats it, he should understand that he is to do good with this food. That when the food comes into him, he is also bringing in his proper end, which is tied, of course, to his innermost being. And indeed, it comes all from his innermost being. So the food does not exist without the meaning, without the end for the sake of which it is given. Without that end, which is the heart, the core of that food, there would be no food. And this is something that medieval Christianity readily recognizes when it speaks, for example, of the pagans who, at their heart, yes, were moved by the Logos towards, of course, the coming of the Christ and the revelation. So they were preparing, so to speak. They were ready. They were being cultivated by the Logos to receive this law that is beyond law, this revelation. Okay? The manifestation. You see this mirror. Look, here in this new doctrine, we see the confirmation of the Logos that is at work within you, within all men. Okay? But this confirmation should not be taken literally, face value. If it is, then you will be delusional. This form that I'm presenting to you, this icon, is not to be understood idolatrously, as an idol. Otherwise, you'll be equivalent to one of these Christian caricatures of pagans. They were looking at statues and they thought they were the actual gods. They were idols. Right? Now, is there an intimate relation between the image and the Logos at the heart, seated at the heart of the human being? As such, of course, it's not an invented image. It's mysterious how it is revealed. Okay? Now this brings us to the question of Greek sculpture. You bring it up. So, with Greek sculpture, it does make sense that the old sculpture, the classical Greek sculptor, recombines particulars he sees. This is what you refer to. You see a pretty ear, you see a pretty nose, you bring them all together, all the pretty foot, you bring them all together, you make a pretty sculpture. Abstracting empirical parts into a new whole. So you're recreating a whole which is prettier. So in this case, nature converts into art. So you shift, right? You have the natural wholes, the physical wholes, and then you take the parts and you recombine them. So recombination via abstraction from experience. Now this, however, could sound like, well, a mechanistic process. Yeah? Even Kant would allow that we do not abstract, however, from experience, but through experience. So what is the sculptor really doing? Is he just taking a piece here, a piece there, and putting them together? Surely we don't mean that. But more importantly, when we are abstracting beauty from a natural physical context, is that natural physical context as such? In other words, what we see, you often speak about reality is what you see. Of course, you acknowledge that there's much more to reality than what we see. But when you say that, okay, we take these things that we see and we, based on that, we create something else. Well, an objection could be that you are not drawing simply parts of empirical aspects, but you're drawing something that is hidden within them. So in the process of abstracting, you're drawing an element from these particular objects of experience, okay, or subjects of experience, as we would say in pre-modern, pre-Cartesian terms. So, for instance, I see a beautiful hand, and I see beauty in it. So I'm not recombining parts mechanically there. That's not what I'm doing, because these are signs of a whole that is alive only when it is born as a whole. So I may be, in fact, as a sculptor, reenacting the constitution of the whole by gathering signs of this whole. Okay, but this is a big, I think, a big topic of discussion. But I'm just trying to give some notes to indicate that there is an alternative to what comes across as a mechanistic process. I understand that you may be citing a translation or an interpreting things that were said in antiquity, but then what does that mean? What is the significance of what was being said? You know, if you want to take it seriously, then you have to look at the original and study it carefully and think about you know, the what is really going on there. And you know, if you consider this enterprise as a postmodern way of escaping from common notions and common sense appreciation of terms, I think that there you would be mistaken, because common sense is a huge question mark today. It's been obscured, and what we call common sense is simply a habit that we have ingrained through modern linguistic habits. Now, so the natural physical, I'm looking at the notes. Yes, here is the occasion or motive. It's the same, boils down to the same occasion or motive for our abstraction, not its source. So we're not physically, we're abstracting. When we see something physical, it is as if we saw a sign that motivates us to abstract. But where is this which we abstract, that we draw out? Where do we draw it out of? Okay, if we look at the situation in modern empiricist terms, well, we mechanically draw it out of that which we see. In Platonic terms, not at all. Not at all. In any case, the physical is not the source of the abstraction. Okay? It's the occasion that moves us. What moves us to abstract? Where do we draw the beautiful form out of? Where do we draw it out of? You know the old line about Michelangelo drawing the form from within the block of marble, right? In other words, there's something hidden, and I'm just bringing it out. Now that's a Platonic, that has a Platonic sense to it. So, the nature, I'm going back to the notes of that motive, the nature of the motive, not nature as in physical nature, empirical. The nature of that motive is a question mark, the meaning of which we can discern only in the mirror of art. So how do you figure out where do you abstract, where do you draw this beautiful art from? Well, you got to look at the art to figure it out, because the art is the mirror of that source of abstraction. Okay? And this is Aristotelian too. The dualism of materiality and sky, I think you refer to these two terms, is at best provisional for serious discourse. Okay, so there's matter, ile, and then we have form, or the sky, I think you refer to. I'm not sure, but I think so. You know, these two terms are simply necessarily but useful terms that are poles of our experience. But the question is, are we bound to abide within the realm of experience, of the empirical, or as human beings, are we transcending our experience all the time? Are we transcending it into new experiences in a futuristic manner, or are we transcending our experience by opening it up to what is constitutionally trans-experiential, trans-empirical, and so the intelligible, the purely intelligible in Platonic terms. And so you get to Picasso. You say, well, again, there's no divide between ancients and moderns. No radical divide, right? You say, well, Picasso, I had referred to Picasso's monsters as being modern entities. And you say, well, no, he's creating monsters just as everybody has created monsters throughout antiquity. They had the monsters. And of course, in the Renaissance, we have all kinds of monsters in painting and sculpture and so forth. So they're all monsters. No. We're not dealing with the same monster. Because Picasso is intentionally raping nature in its modern conception. Okay? In its modern conception. Picasso has studied Nietzsche. Nietzsche is his Bible. Okay? That's not what the ancients were doing. The ancient monster derives from a confusion of the human, the slave, and the divine, the master. And so they're saying, essentially, with the monster, they say, well, you see what happens when you mix the slave and the master, authority and its subjects? You have a conflation of the two, okay? Or even of authority and freedom conflated into each other. You end up with monsters, okay? You don't mix the God, they don't, copulate together. The God and the human. They end up with monsters. This is now, of course, when it's properly done, you don't have, you have the God and the divine and the human element. They cross each other correctly, properly, and then you end up with the hero. But that's something exceptional. For the most part, there's a warning against monsters. You want to conflate the two, you end up with a monstrosity. Okay? Now, when the two are confused, of course, monstrosities ensue. However, with Picasso, confusion is the fundamental datum, as is the absurdity of existence that propels the man aligned with it, to carry on its playful duties. So it's our destiny. Monstrosity is beauty, because it's carrying out the work of, in Hegel's terms, the work of death, of history as death, the playing of death. So, it's great. It's destiny. The monster is destiny. It's not playful in the Renaissance term, where you're taking it as, they are framing it in a poetic context. Okay, there's no poetry. It's the destruction of poetry that gives you a monstrosity with Picasso. There's no beauty in his monsters. They're just mechanically broken, and it's just pathetic as far as the classics up to the Renaissance and so forth, and even later, of course, but in a pre-modern context in general. The first cave, you would have, so that's the alternatives you would have there. So they're just two different entities, the two different problems there. Obviously, they're related, as I have just suggested, but no, Picasso's monsters are a novelty, just as Nietzsche is. Okay, and you can go to Thrasymachus in Plato and say, oh well, already you have Nietzsche. No, we can go on to these characters one by one if you want, but definitely not. I say that Picasso's monsters do not evoke confusion in the context of an underlying order, a taxis fusios, to speak with Aristotle. So the order of nature, right, that is fundamental. But they indicate the breakdown of order in the context of our ordinary experience, right? The breakdown of our ordinary experience in the context of an underlying fundamental chaos. What is more, this chaos is understood empirically, however, as entering, right, into experience, not as an object of contemplation, as for the ancient materialists, but as a force that enters into our daily lives, propelling them forward, empowering those spirits that dare embrace it. So we have amor fati with Nietzsche. Okay? It's not Stoicism. It's nothing. It's unprecedented with respect to the models that we have in antiquity. So not surprisingly, of course, Picasso loves Nietzsche. Now, the distinction then between antiquity and modernity is not a mere matter of quantity as, Paul, you presented. Again, the ancients were not oriented the way modern man is, namely towards infinite empowerment, or sometimes called progress, right? Infinite progress, which is an absurdity, of course. What does it mean to progress infinitely? It means you don't. They were taught about the madness of love of power, but they recognized the absurdity of any society built upon it. I hope that what I said before explained this adequately. Okay, now I'm looking at my notes. So why warn against it then? Well, because there were some solitary fellows who sought the metaphysical by abandoning the ethical. Now, that was a concern, you see. The fool who abandons the ethical in the pursuit of the metaphysical is a concern. In the wake of medieval Christianity, modernity, however, tries to reduce the metaphysical within the domain of the ethical. Now, this is precisely what Galileo and others were up to. Okay? Spinoza, of course. They reduce the metaphysical through this new mathematics. Symbolically, they reduce it symbolically within the domain of the ethical. And so they create a new ethical world, which includes the moral imperatives that Kantian eventually, that are unprecedented. Right? The rise of a morality that is universal in Kantian terms is unprecedented. So this is secularism. Okay? Trying to achieve consciously and collectively in the element of calculation what in antiquity could be only an unconscious drive in a few solitary souls. This is what the moderns try to do scientifically. Modern science, the scientific approach to life, and modern sense of science, is precisely that. Who would have ever attempted the reduction in question in antiquity? To say nothing of the technology needed to achieve that reduction, nobody tried to use nature itself, but merely use things on the basis of nature. So, bodies, yes, but there was an understanding, there was an underlying source of those bodies, a natural substratum that was pre-empirical. Okay? So, to master not nature, but arts on the basis of nature, this is what the ancients were about. And in my gentle demolition of the volume Mastery of Nature, I don't know if you read it, the 2 parts in the journal interpretation, I tackled that issue, and I'm showing that that's a couple of those authors involved were recognizing this tangentially, but overall there was a problem of lack of understanding of this issue. In other words, the ancients mastered arts, not the nature that served as a foundation of the arts, and that nature is not just a body in out there, an object of or a subject to experience. Okay, it's not an empirical entity, but it is the fundamental condition for that experience to take shape. The realization of Babel requires not merely alchemy what we have in antiquity, but modernity's chemistry. That's why it would have been impossible for the another reason why why Tower of Babel would have been impossible for the ancients. It required a modification of alchemy. You drop the al, the Arabic al, and you end up with chemistry, which is this modern scientific enterprise, so-called scientific, that, of course, has mechanistic, is predicated of mechanistic, thoroughly mechanistic, modern conception of nature. And again, the ancients, among the ancients, you do have conceptions of mechanistic conceptions of nature, but not progressive. The reduction of the metaphysical to the ethical, then, is impossible without conceiving the former in terms of modern symbolic abstractions. And to my knowledge, there's no better account of the mode of symbolic abstraction that you have in modern language and mathematics than the one offered by Jacob Klein in his work on precisely on mathematics. So, and there he goes on to from the early Greeks, you could say, onto that early modern revolution, and he also deals with Descartes, of course, if you know the volume. So, that's my response to you, Paul. What I've been talking about is the divide between the ancients and the moderns, and we can move on. If there are objections from you, there will be welcome. Ciao.